I'm recording once again here. At Coronado Ferry Landing, and we're discussing a book in our upcoming book club called Remains of the Day by a Japanese author and famously starring Anthony Hopkins as a butler in the movie. And in that movie, Hopkins plays a butler who is serving a British lord in the late 1930s during a period when the Nazis are attempting to develop diplomatic and military relationships with wealthy English political leaders, such as Lord of the Manor, which Hopkins is serving as a butler. This was a book that was originally suggested to me by Dean Paul Brest and his fellow instructor at Stanford Law School. And the book stands for the proposition that a butler or a employee, an attorney, a lawyer, should not serve the needs of his client, his employer, without exercising moral judgment, what in the practice of law is called good moral character. This was a book that was used for this teaching purpose in a professional school, which is of some importance because the curriculum at Stanford Law School or any accredited law school is chosen not for its literary value, but for its value in preparing the student, future lawyer, for practice. And California and most states or jurisdictions such as canon law, there is usually a moral character requirement, some type of an ethics exam, professional responsibility exam. So this is the main importance of the book in my experience with it. As a historian, and having focused on the literature of the Vietnam War in my study at Harvard, where I earned a degree in history and literature and comparative religion, magna cum laude, and a minor in comparative religion. The importance of looking at World War II now and the great power politics that preceded World War II is especially timely, because we are in a period of great power competition again, that is similar to the 1920s and 1930s, where we are coming out of a long period of small wars. In the case of the 20s and 30s, we had small wars that the Marine Corps fought in countries that include Haiti, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. And these are well written about in Ruud Krulak, Sr., who is a U.S. Marine Corps retired lieutenant general whose last command was Fleet Marine Force Pacific. in his book First to Fight. And I make reference to the professional reading list of the Marine Corps because it's a very well-developed body of professional military education. This period is also written about in a book called Mars Learning, which is written by a man named Keith Bickel. That's spelled Bravo, India, Charlie, Kilo, Echo, Lima, for those of us who spell things according to military alpha phonetics. And I would commend to you an article in a magazine called Proceedings, which is the professional journal of the U.S. Naval Institute, the Naval Academy, back in Annapolis and in the beautiful coastal tidelands of Maryland and Virginia. And the article is entitled "Losing the Great Pacific War," and it is written by a Captain 06 Burnett, and the premise of the article is that the author is the administrator of the Merchant Marine, which is part of the Department of Transportation, the administrator of the Maritime Administration, Merchant Marine, describing why we lost the Great Pacific War from the date of 2025. And as I record this, it's May of 2019, which would be 6 years prior to this memorandum. The memorandum is titled "Lessons from Recent Military Actions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans." And it's a short article, only 2 full printed pages. And it is an article that is of a similar to other articles in this genre, the genre being professional military writing in professional journals like Proceedings. The Marine Corps Gazette is the one for the U.S. Marine Corps. And the popular websites that cover this are Task and Purpose, Real Clear Defense. And the premise of the article is that the Merchant Marine force of ships, which totals about 90 ships with about another 80 reserve ships, and I'm not an expert on this, I'm a former Marine officer, but this is not my area. But the premise of the article is that those 180 so ships were not enough to reinforce the United States surge force to respond to a major contingency under the National Defense Strategy in a time of war. To review, the National Defense Strategy is a specific document that was published on January 19th, 2018 by Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, who announced it in a policy lecture at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he made reference to his mentor and maybe the only Marine who outranks him in government service, George Shultz. And he made reference to the importance of diplomats in the National Defense Strategy, and as he always has as a Secretary of Defense, clearly subordinated the mission of the Department of Defense to enhance the effectiveness of American diplomats in the Department of State. And as such, the National Defense Strategy of January 2018 is still the authoritative current guidance for the American military. So this book that we're reading about the interwar period from 1925 to 1940, the remains of the day, and great power representatives of the Nazi German government tried to establish diplomatic connections with the high-level British political influencers, wealthy British property owner in the novel Remains of the Day is especially appropriate. So I put that into context of articles like the one I referred to in Proceedings. And then I'll also make reference to two other books which I've been reading recently. One of the things we always talk about in Bob Schultz's excellent book club, and Bob's a retired U.S. Navy captain, 06, Navy Special Warfare. One of the most important books that I've been reading recently is Startup Nation. Startup Nation is written by Dan Senor, who worked in the Bush White House, and it's about Israeli Jewish entrepreneurship. The reason that it is so important now is because of the importance of Israel. Israel, I would argue, in my experience as a former commissioned officer and as a Harvard-trained historian and a Stanford-trained lawyer, is our most important ally for several reasons. One of those is because it's in weapons range of Suez. Suez, along with Malacca and the Baltics and Hormuz, are of the 3 or 4 strategic choke points which control the reserve currency status of the US dollar, which is currently the reserve currency. But there are other possible countries. All 180 countries on the globe could be the reserve currency. It is clear that the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, would like to displace the United States dollar as the reserve currency. The other reason that Startup Nation is so important now is because, in my experience as a veteran and an entrepreneur, Startup Nation is the best book about veteran entrepreneurship. So this is the leading book that I use in a course to teach veteran entrepreneurship, along with Jim Collins' Good to Great and Great by Choice and The Economist magazine. The next book that I will point to as a particularly timely and compelling book, to the extent that I would recommend strongly to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Secretary of Defense, that we add it to the professional military education and Marine Corps reading list, is Exorbitant Privilege by Aiken Green. Aiken Green is an economist and a fund manager, and the phrase exorbitant privilege is from a French politician who described the reserve currency as an exorbitant privilege that the country that holds this reserve currency has, because having the reserve currency in effect means that the country that has the reserve currency can borrow an almost indefinite amount of money from the rest of the world. The reason that a country has the reserve currency is because it has the strongest navy. It's become somewhat of a political football to talk about, make America great again, but in calm, bipartisan, logical, unassailable reasoning, the reason that America is the greatest country in the world is because our military is the strongest. Specifically, we are the greatest country, and by greatest I mean we have the highest GDP at roughly $17 trillion, with China at $11 trillion. We have the greatest country at $17 trillion because we control the strategic choke points. This is something that the founders of the Constitution clearly recognized, because the Navy is the only military service that is guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. So, and this book describes how the reserve currency changed hands in 1956, which was at Suez, and Israel played a key role when, in 1956, the reserve currency decisively shifted finally from the U.S. dollar, from the British pound to the U.S. dollar. Eichen Green writes that there may have been a period that the reserve currency shifted from the British pound to the U.S. dollar between 1925 and 1956. But in any case, it clearly decisively did finally shift in 1956. Before that, in 1805, also at the Battle of Trafalgar, the reserve currency shifted from Spain to Great Britain, also due to a decisive military action, a naval action. Another good book to read in that regard is The Price of Admiralty by the recently deceased, and until his death, our greatest living military historian, John Keegan. The Price of Admiralty covers the Battle of Trafalgar, and it also covers the submarine war of World War II, and it makes the point that the decisive weapon of naval warfare after World War II is the submarine. We haven't had any great power naval fights since the end of World War II, but if we do, and if Keegan is right, the decisive weapon will be the submarine. So the submarine base here in San Diego, which is further on up the harbor, tucked in to Point Loma, would be a key location. And if Keegan is right, the carriers, which normally occupy a couple of berths at North Island, would be less important than the submarine. But you would have a hard time convincing naval aviators or admirals who came up through surface warfare of that proposition. And while I'm talking about books I've been reading recently, I point to Heroic Leadership by Chris Lowney. Chris Lowney is a successful banker with 23 years at JP Morgan, who is retired. And before he became a banker, he was a Jesuit priest in formation for 4 years, not unlike Jerry Brown, recent governor of California. And in his book Heroic Leadership, he basically studies the Society of Jesus as a business school case study. I would make the proposition to students, especially from Catholic schools or from Jesuit institutions, that Heroic Leadership is a very good book to translate the values of Catholic education into business life, because it's a way of studying the success of the Society of Jesus. And not incidentally, the current Pope is a Jesuit, and I would say that after Israel, the most important diplomatic relationship the United States has is with the Vatican. And that is specifically because there is a real chain of command in the sense of both a legal and of a military chain of command that comes from the Pope to the local bishops and to the presidents and the Jesuits who run the 870 or so Jesuit schools around the world. If you listen to a military leader like Admiral McRaven, who is easy to find on YouTube, he makes a speech about what his first assignment was after 9/11. He was working in the Pentagon, and he was a flag officer, maybe a 1-star at that time. And he talks about this exciting call from the White House. Admiral McRaven, we need you to come in and write an important document. And McRaven responds, well, I'm ready to go. What's the assignment? And the assignment is to write a case or argument about why the 9/11 attacks were cause for a just war. And I would propose to the top level leaders that this is still a very, very important subject, maybe even more important, and to apply the just war doctrine to cyber warfare and to war between civilizations. The 7 or so civilizations that my Harvard professor Samuel Huntington defined, most prominently Western, Sinic, which is spelled S-I-N-I-C, which is Chinese civilization, Russian civilization, which Huntington defines as Slavic Orthodox civilization, and Islamic civilization. Islamic being number 4 on that list. Then Hindu, which is essentially India, and then South American civilization, and then Japanese civilization, and then the 8th one, African civilization. Those 8 groupings